Welcome to the second part of Chapter 22. In this podcast, we're going to discuss the evidence that ultimately supports and helped Darwin arrive at the idea of evolution via natural selection. So, first of all, we said that he took a voyage, and along that voyage, he especially hit a lot of coastlines and he hit several islands. So, this sets up this idea of biogeography, looking at where things live, looking at what lives where. And so, along the way, as he stopped at places like Australia, he'd noticed that in Australia there's something called a mara, which is a marsupial that looks kind of similar to a rabbit, and it lives in a rabbit-like habitat, but it's not a placental, what we would consider normal rabbit, that is not a marsupial, doesn't have a pouch, has a placenta, and nourishes its young the entire time in the uterus. And so it just so happens, too, that in the 1800s, that they did release some not too brilliant British person, a group of rabbits in Australia, and they've thrived. They're now a nuisance species, they're invasive, they can outcompete the native species. So it's not that rabbits can't live in Australia. It's not like the habitat wasn't perfect for rabbits. But what he started to realize is the stuff that you find in certain places appears to be there because at some point something like it evolved in that area, or at least started to exist. And from there it appears as though that whatever existed there kind of branched off. This idea of descent with modification. So in Australia, there's plenty of mammals, but they're all marsupials that were native. They don't see these placental mammals, even though the environment is perfect for them. And so this got in his mind where he was thinking it's not about someone putting things places where they fit. It's more about things adapting to the environment wherever they could reach. And so a good playground for this was islands like the Galapagos or Australia, where in this case marsupials were in Australia, so they adapted to have characteristics that allowed them to live on grasslands. Just like you had placental mammals that were in regular continents like North America, South America, and they adapted to live in places like grasslands, but they adapted as placental mammals. And so we get similar looking organisms, but if you look at their internals, if you will, they're not the same. They're not related. And the explanation for this is it's up to who evolved where and where they could get to. So on an island, you'll see lots of things that can fly, like birds, or plants that can kind of float their seeds, made it to the islands and populated them. And the species that made it to these islands typically look a lot like the mainland species because they appear to be descended from them. That appears to be who flew over, got lucky on the breeze, and managed to get there. And then once we had a couple of these birds so they could interbreed, over time they adapted to different habitats that were on the island. So oftentimes we'll find a bunch of different related species of, say, finch, if you want to use Darwin's finches, and these related species of finch fill roles that the mainland bird did not typically. Because on the mainland, there might have been some other bird that was eating a particular type of insect, or that was feeding on a particular type of seed. And so if that other guy's there, you don't end up taking on that role as a finch. You just do your normal finchly duties. But if no one else is there to compete with you, finches that can do some other job, like crack larger nuts because they happen to have a thicker or bigger or sharper beak, they survive and they thrive because they have this food supply that no one else is using. And so those birds can then become a new species of finch. And so we end up seeing on islands oftentimes this what's called an adaptive radiation. So a bunch of similar species of finch or of certain types of plants. I believe swordtails is a type of plant you see in Hawaii where there's like 50 species of it. And so we see this on islands. And so it doesn't appear to be, do finches normally do that role? Are finches well set to do that role by default? It more appears to be finches somehow got there and they've adapted to fill these roles, hence evolution via natural selection, not just them being placed somewhere. You'll also see with biogeography, we see this with past, like the old Earth, if you want to go with this idea that we have well supported, that the Earth has plate tectonics, it's been around a long time, and so this works out well because, for instance, the fossils that we find from millions of years back along the eastern coastline of South America closely match the fossils that we find on the western coast of Africa. Not to mention the two look like they could fit together. And so this supports this idea that the Earth is older, it's been undergoing geological change for a long time, and that geological change appears to at least play some part in the ultimate changing of animals and who lives where. So that's biogeography in a nutshell. Now, then we got the fossil record. This one I don't think takes a ridiculous amount of explaining, but we have found and been able to predict, which is a very viable, important scientific tool, what the fossils will look like. We can document how they change over time. We can predict what we should see. So if there's a gap, we can kind of predict what we should find at some point in that gap and what we should not find. And thus far, we keep getting back confirmation that everything that we've been talking about is well supported. Nothing else explains this gradual shift where we find fossils of prehistoric kangaroos in Australia, where kangaroos are at, and not somewhere else randomly. It appears to be that we had this, primitive kangaroo that kind of initially evolved, and we can see oftentimes these transitions to get to that point, and then from there it can diverge to make multiple species of kangaroo that still might be alive today. We can look at whales and we can see the gradual change as the legs get smaller eventually, and then you can see the nostrils moving up, and you can see the pelvis and the rear legs kind of pulling inside the body and becoming more and more reduced is what you typically call that. And so we can see all these gradual changes, and we keep finding more and more of these gradual changes as we look, these transitional links as we call them. And so there's always going to be more stuff because not that many things fossilize. So we're never going to have something that's like every organism that ever lived. But we do have a ridiculous number of fossils, and right now all of those fossils agree with evolution and support evolution and do not support anything else. So this succession of forms idea, that's the gradual change where we see that we don't just suddenly have a rabbit that pops up in the Ordovician with early fishes. We see this gradual shift to where we get mammals, then we start to see the diversity amongst mammals, then we see dinosaurs come through and that kind of diminishes. And then eventually we see after dinosaurs go away, we see the gradual spreading of mammals once again. We see them start to move into the water with things like whales and seals. But we see all of these things, especially amongst vertebrates, and some invertebrates that had hard shells. So some things like insects, certainly crustaceans, we can see a fair amount because they have these rigid parts. They tend to fossilize more. Things like worms, they don't tend to fossilize as much. So there will be some organisms that we don't have as good of a fossil record of. But thus far, nothing is going to kind of throw a wrench into the cogs of evolution, if you will. Next, we've got comparative anatomy. Comparative anatomy is where we say, what structures do you have? Do they look like other people's structures? So if we look at something like a whale fin, that's going to be this guy right here. If we look at the wing of a bird, that's this guy right here, this will be a cat leg, and this will be a human. I believe it's arm is what we're going with here, I hope. Otherwise, those are really weird feet. And so we're going to look at these, and you can see that there's these consistencies amongst all of these arm structures. You'll see that we have one bone up top. We've got two bones in the forearm. We've got a series of wrist bones. That's what's in yellow. Below that, we've got ultimately the bones of the hand and the fingers. And so each of these organisms, whether it's a whale where it's just kind of compressed everything up and into the fin, whether it's the bird where it's kind of elongated stuff, if you looked at a bat, you'd see it's similar. It just has really long fingers that make up most of the wing. Whenever you look at these, you see it's the exact same materials that they're using. All they're doing is tweaking them a bit. That's Darwin's idea of descent with modification. Why is it that we don't have two bones up at the top? It appears as though the ancestor of vertebrates had one bone, and so we've all just kind of inherited it. It's kind of our baggage that we come and we work with, and so we have to make do with what we have. And so you can change the size of them. You can a little bit shift the organization. You can see it's pretty similar, but in some cases you might see the wrist bones more single file versus double file. But for the most part, we're making relatively small changes just in size and slight position to get to all these forms that we know of that look so different. Bird wing does not really look like a cat's arm or a cat's, whatever structure, leg, arm, whatever you want to call it. The front leg on a cat, they don't look alike superficially. But if you break them down and look at the bones, you'll see that these do appear to be related. And so we call that homology when the organisms that possess these similarities appear to do so because of a common ancestor. So somebody had four legs, they had these limbs with this bone structure, and all of these guys that we're looking at here were descended from that individual, and so they inherited this. It's a trait that's from at some point, common ancestor they possessed. Now, analogy will be kind of the opposite of that, So this is more like me looking at a lobster claw and saying, hey, look, it can grab. And then me looking at something like a chameleon, if you remember from True Facts, the chameleon has the weird, grasping hand type parts, which are going to be built much like ours. But if we look at those two and we actually examine the insides, we're going to see that the chameleon has internal bone structure that's much like our bone structure, whereas the lobster has an exoskeleton. It's very, very different. So even though superficially they may look kind of similar, they're not related. There was no common lobster, chameleon common ancestor that possessed this kind of grasping hand claw thing that passed on to both of those. What appears to have happened here is they've both evolved to have those structures because it was beneficial for their environment, but they're not related. So this is kind of like fish are torpedo-shaped, seals and whales are torpedo-shaped, penguins are torpedo-shaped. We're not saying there's a common ancestor that was torpedo-shaped that gave rise to whales, penguins, and fish. No. We saw animals that were not torpedo-shaped, namely birds and mammals, evolved to have that shape because it made it easiest for them to swim. And so in that case, we would call that convergence, where they're kind of coming together to have similar traits because the environment selects for those traits. Those individuals that have traits like that live and reproduce best. Whereas things like mammals here that we can see, vertebrates here, shouldn't say mammals, birds aren't mammals, but the vertebrates here, they're going through divergence, where those initial vertebrates are now spreading out and they're starting to get more and more different from each other. So they do share a common ancestor, but that common ancestor wasn't able to do all of these tasks initially. So as it adapted bit by bit, it was able to kind of go in different directions. And so eventually at the end, we now have birds and whales and, any of the mammals you want to pick, primates and felines, I guess we'll use here. And so that's the idea of divergence and convergence. Those finches on the Galapagos were undergoing divergence. There was a common ancestor finch that was getting more and more different to become all the different species of finch there today. Now, vestigial organs are really, really cool. These are leftover organs that appear to be evolutionary baggage that don't seem to serve, at least not their original purpose. And so this is like humans can still be born with tails. We still have a tailbone regardless. That ultimately appears to be vestigial. The appendix, there's some debate. It's certainly vestigial if its original role was as a cecum, which is to break down like plant material if you're an herbivore. But it might still serve a little bit of an immune function, so I'm not going to completely write that one out. You could say male nipples. Don't really use them too much unless you're big into nursing and you're male and you figured that one out somehow. So there's going to be a variety of these vestigial organs that we see. In whales, they still have a pelvis and they have some of their leg bones. So do snakes, even though they don't really have rear legs. And the coolest thing to me, and I know I'm a nerd, but there's also things called atavisms, which are when these things that appear to have disappeared, we'll go with it, come back. So this is like occasionally you'll see a chicken born with like teeth. They call it hen's teeth or hen's tooth. And so that appears to be a good reminder that these appear to have evolved from reptiles that had teeth. And those genes have been inactivated most likely, but occasionally a screw-up occurs and they come back. Or people that have actual tails. And I believe in some case they even have the musculature so they can wag it a little bit. So if you're a dog or a cat person, maybe a decent idea to look for that. So there's a variety of things. You've had snakes and you've had dolphins that have had like fins or like leg-looking structures that they've had that aren't usually functional, but they're still sticking out of their body. So it just makes you remember like, hey, it looks as though there's still some genes kicking around in there. It really supports this idea of evolution, that we still have all this old baggage, that if you're making something from scratch, there's absolutely no reason to put all that baggage in there to allow for those things to crop up. Now, comparative embryology I'm going to be fairly quick about, but this one's cool mostly for the fact that when you're developing as an embryo, many embryos go through certain phases where they have things like pharyngeal pouches, which will be these kind of wrinkly structures you can't see too well here. And these structures will develop into different things based on who you are. This can become gills in a fish. We still develop them even though we don't have gills as, terrestrial vertebrates, but they tend to become more parts of things like the jaw and the ear. So they've been repurposed, but we still have them. Same thing with a tail. We still have the tail, or webbing between our fingers that apoptosis clears out. And so as an embryo, we can oftentimes see similarities between different organisms, such as vertebrates, that aren't there as adults. And we can see how many of these similarities that we keep kind of lets us know how far back we split. And so if we have where our pharyngeal pouches develop into the same general structures, that lets us know we're a lot more similar to that organism. We've shared a more recent common ancestor than someone with which it develops into gills, or it develops into different structures, different parts of the throat and ear and jaw than us. And so you can kind of see how long two organisms kind of travel the same embryological path, if you will, or at least similar, I'll say, before they diverge, and it gives you a sense of just how dissimilar they are. So the bottom guy, if he diverges earlier, would be less similar. This might be like a fish and a person, fish person, versus if you're talking about like two primates, we're going to have a lot of stuff in common. We're going to have a lot of our characteristics in common. So we may not look identical, but at least what things are developing to what when would be very similar. You know, which structures are going to go away. It's like in a chimpanzee or something, the fact we get rid of the tail still, and which structures develop in the exact same adult structures, such as which pharyngeal pouches develop into jaw or an ear or whatever else. Now, molecular biology, this one supports it because we see everything has this universal code. It's not like every organism, if it's going to live entirely on its own, needs to have a common genetic code, needs to follow this sequence we've talked about of codons that convert to specific amino acids. We don't need to see different organisms share the exact same proteins or the exact same DNA. We don't need to see where organisms that look more and more dissimilar share less DNA and protein. This one's probably one of the strongest evidences just because we didn't even know about this back when the idea of evolution and much of the evolutionary organization of who's related to who first came about. And so once we discovered DNA and protein and could analyze this really starting in about the 70s, this was something that could easily disprove everything if it didn't match up. But instead we see there is this commonality amongst all life that appears as though there was a common ancestor billions of years back that had this code that gave rise to all of our cells now. And we see this correlation once again between what we believe is the degree of relatedness and the degree of relatedness between their DNA and their proteins. It doesn't have to happen that way, but it does. So we share almost all the same proteins, almost all the same DNA sequences with something like a chimpanzee, but we share a lot less with something like a dog, less with a frog, less with a fish, less with a plant. And as I wrap this up, I just want to make sure you guys are comfortable with, I throw times around quite a bit, and I want you to realize when we talk about geological time like billions of years ago or millions of years ago, there's lots of ways that we'll discuss more later of figuring that out. So we've got relative dating, which goes by layer, where the newest stuff is on top. So as you go down, it gets older and older. There's radiometric dating, which is using radioactive elements that break apart at a set pace, so we can actually figure out how old it is based upon how much of the radioactive stuff is there and how much of the stuff it breaks down into. There's tidal stuff, so we can ultimately use like the references of how tidal stuff has come in, gone out. A lot of organisms that were around the tidal areas we can actually look at, and there's rings, and it tells us day length, and it tells us how many days there were in a year. And so based upon using those things, we know roughly how long a day was at various points in history. So we can use this to verify that it's around a certain time. So this one's used with certain, I believe, corals and such. Molecular clocks, which is mutation rate. You've got tree rings and ice cores if it's something a bit more recent. And there's a ton more. There's over 20 different ways that we date things, and for many of these things, we can date it multiple different ways. And so we can verify not just one way. We're not just pulling a number out of a hat or just relying on one method. We have many different ways of independently verifying that what we're talking about as an age is at least pretty accurate. So without any additional evidence, this is not as simple as some people like to make it. And my final note, Alfred Wallace also was able to come up with the theory of natural selection. He did it without help, but he came up with like a 2-page paper. And while he did present it with Darwin, because he gave it to Darwin to look over, Darwin said, "Oh yeah, I got a book about this." So even though he did co-present it, so he is technically kind of latched onto it because he didn't write the book about it, because he didn't have all the evidence, we oftentimes tend to leave him out. So I figured before I wrap up this chapter, I'd at least give him one quick nod. Alfred Wallace, the co-discoverer of natural selection. Have a good one, guys.